The school van rumbled down the quiet suburban street, its passengers chatting excitedly about the field trip ahead. The morning was overcast, a heavy grayness clinging to the world like a blanket. Inside the van, Nina sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the mist-covered trees as they sped by. She wasn't like the other kids. She kept to herself, preferring the quiet over the noisy banter of her classmates. Jake, the class clown, sat in the middle row, cracking jokes that earned half-hearted laughs from a few students. Melissa, always bossy, was busy organizing her papers, her attention divided between her clipboard and barking orders at the others. Ethan, shy and withdrawn, sat nervously at the back, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his seat. And Mr. Harris, their teacher, sat at the front, preoccupied with his phone. Nina's attention shifted to the driver. He was a silent man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a cap pulled low over his face. He hadn't said a word since they boarded. In fact, Nina couldn't recall ever seeing him at school before. Something about him unsettled her. The way he never looked back, never acknowledged their presence, just drove forward in absolute silence. As the van turned onto a narrow road leading into the woods, the familiar scenery of the town faded away. The trees grew denser, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Nina frowned. They were supposed to take the highway, weren't they? Why had they turned into the woods? She glanced around, but no one else seemed concerned. Jake was still laughing, Melissa still busy, Ethan still nervous. Mr. Harris didn't even lift his eyes from his phone. The road stretched on, twisting deeper into the forest, the mist thickening around them. An hour passed, then two. Nina's heart began to race. They should have reached their destination by now. She looked out the window again, but the view hadn't changed. Just more trees, more fog, more of the same. She leaned forward, tapping Mr. Harris on the shoulder. "Sir," she whispered, "shouldn't we be there by now?" Mr. Harris frowned, glancing up for the first time. "You're right," he muttered, checking his watch. "We should have arrived a while ago." He stood up and walked to the front of the van, knocking on the glass separating the driver from the passengers. "Excuse me, sir, are we lost?" The driver didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. "Excuse me." Mr. Harris knocked harder. The driver's eyes, visible in the rearview mirror, remained fixed on the road. They were cold, vacant. Nina felt a chill run down her spine. Something was very wrong. Suddenly, there was a scream. Everyone turned. Ethan, who had been sitting at the back, was gone. His seat was empty, his bag still lying on the floor. There was no sound, no movement, just the eerie emptiness where he had been. Panic erupted. Jake stood up, shouting Ethan's name. Melissa looked pale, clutching her clipboard tightly, while Mr. Harris pounded on the glass in desperation. But the driver didn't stop. He didn't even acknowledge what had happened. Nina's heart raced as she slowly lifted her head. The van was in the middle of the woods, surrounded by dense fog. She glanced around. Jake was gone. Mr. Harris was gone. She was alone. The driver sat still, his hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Nina's throat tightened as she slowly stood up, her legs trembling. She approached the front of the van, her eyes locked on the driver. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, emotionless stare. Without thinking, she reached for the door handle. To her surprise, it opened. She stumbled out of the van, the cold air biting at her skin. The mist was thick, swirling around her like a living entity. She looked back at the van. It sat there, silent and still, like a beast waiting to devour its prey. Nina turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away. The trees closed in around her, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. The mist swallowed everything, blurring the world into a nightmare. Suddenly, the sound of the van's engine roared to life behind her. She froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned around. The van was there, headlights glowing through the mist, the engine rumbling like a predator stalking its prey. The driver's face was visible through the windshield, his eyes fixed on her, that eerie smile curling on his lips. Nina's legs moved before her mind could process what was happening. She ran, faster than she ever had, her feet pounding against the damp earth. But no matter how fast she ran, the sound of the van grew closer, the rumble of the engine louder. Nina's breath came in short gasps as fear gripped her chest. She glanced out the window again. The mist was thicker now, swirling like a living thing. The road outside seemed endless, looping over and over. There were no landmarks, no signs, no way to tell where they were. Another scream. Melissa was gone. One moment she was there, and the next gone. Her clipboard clattered to the floor, papers scattering like leaves in the wind. Nina felt her heart pounding in her throat. She looked at Jake, who was now pale. His bravado shattered. Mr. Harris was frantically trying to open the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The van was a prison, driving them into some unknown abyss. Jake slumped into his seat, his face buried in his hands. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This can't be happening." Nina's eyes darted around the van, her mind racing. She had to stay calm. She had to figure out what was going on. But every second felt like an eternity, the air thick with terror. The driver's face loomed large in the rearview mirror, his cold eyes meeting hers. For the first time, he smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that sent shivers down her spine. Suddenly, the van swerved. Nina clutched the seat in front of her as the van veered off the road, crashing through the trees. Branches scraped against the windows, the sound shrill and terrifying. The van jolted violently, throwing them all around, before finally skidding to a stop. Silence. The mist thickened, wrapping around her like a shroud, and suddenly, she couldn't see anything. She was lost in a world of fog, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. And then, everything went silent. Nina stopped, her chest heaving, her body trembling. The van was gone. The sound of the engine was gone. She was alone in the mist, the silence oppressive. But as she stood there, catching her breath, she realized something terrible. She wasn't alone. The mist shifted, and in the distance, she saw them. Shadowy figures, standing still, watching her. They were the others, the ones who had vanished. Ethan, Melissa, Jake, Mr. Harris. They stood there, silent and unmoving, their eyes hollow and dark. Nina took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The figures didn't move, but their presence filled the air with a suffocating dread. She could feel their eyes on her, cold and lifeless. And then, she heard it. The van's engine. It was behind her. Slowly, she turned. The headlights pierced through the mist, the engine rumbling softly. The driver sat there, waiting. The door to the van opened, inviting her in. Nina's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, the weight of her terror too much to bear. There was no escape. The van would always find her. The ride would never end. With a final, broken sob, she got to her feet and walked toward the van. She climbed in. The door closed behind her, and the van drove on, into the endless mist. The last ride had begun again. Thanks for watching. Click on this if you are enjoying it.